My daughter Jessica looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mom, you need to stop acting like you own this place." She had no idea that tucked away in my safe deposit box were the original property deeds, business licenses, and incorporation papers. That proved I didn't just act like I owned it, I literally built it from nothing. When she gathered the entire family for what she called a necessary intervention about Mom's behavior, I simply pulled out my folder of documents and watched 30 years of assumptions crumble in real time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Michelle Torres, and at 62 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal life could throw at me. I was wrong. The deepest cut came not from a stranger or an enemy, but from the daughter I'd sacrificed everything to raise, standing in the middle of the restaurant I'd built from scratch, telling me I was embarrassing myself by acting like I belonged there. The Desert Rose Café sits on the outskirts of Henderson, Nevada, about 20 minutes southeast of Las Vegas. It's not fancy, never tried to be. Red vinyl booths line the windows, the kind that stick to your legs in summer despite the air conditioning, running full blast. The walls are covered with faded photographs of the early days, me with a paintbrush in hand, transforming what used to be a rundown gas station into something that smelled like fresh coffee and homemade pie instead of motor, oil and cigarettes. I'd been working in that building for over 3 decades, first as a waitress when it was Mickey's Diner, then as the manager when old Mickey got too sick to handle the books. When he decided to sell in 1992, I was the only one crazy enough to think a single mother with a high school education and $700 in savings could make something of the place. Everyone told me I was dreaming too big. Everyone except Robert. Robert Torres was a contractor who'd been coming in for coffee every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years before he finally worked up the courage to ask me out. He had calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which he did every time he looked at me like I was something special. We married 6 months later in a ceremony so small we held it right there in the diner after closing time, with Jessica as our only witness. She was 8 then, all gap-toothed grins and excited chatter about having a new daddy. Robert didn't just marry me. He married my dream. He spent his weekends and evenings helping me renovate, teaching me about permits and inspections and all the bureaucratic nonsense that comes with owning a business. When I wanted to expand the kitchen, he drew up the plans himself. When the city tried to shut us down over some ridiculous parking ordinance, he stood beside me at every council meeting until we won. When Jessica needed help with her homework, he'd sit at table 6 with her while I finished the dinner rush, patiently, explaining algebra problems between orders of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. The Desert Rose became more than a restaurant. It became the center of our world. Jessica grew up there, doing her homework in the corner booth, helping me refill salt shakers and roll silverware. Regular customers watched her grow from a shy 8-year-old into a confident teenager who could work the register and charm even the grumpiest truckers into leaving decent tips. I thought she understood what this place meant to us, what it represented. I thought she was proud of what we'd built together. Robert died 4 years ago. Heart attack, sudden and brutal, the kind that takes a man who seemed perfectly healthy and leaves everyone asking why. The funeral was held at St. Catherine's, but the real memorial happened at the Desert Rose. For 3 days straight, customers came to pay their respects, sharing stories about how Robert had helped them move or fixed their car for free, or how he and I had hired their teenager when no one else would give them a chance. The flowers covered every table, and I kept the restaurant closed for a week because I couldn't stop crying long enough to make coffee. Jessica flew in from Los Angeles for the funeral. She'd been living there for almost 10 years by then, working her way up in some marketing firm that specialized in luxury brands. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than I made in a month and kept checking her phone during the service. Afterward, she sat with me in the empty restaurant and told me I should consider selling. "Mom, you're almost 60 now. she'd said, her voice gentle but firm. This place is too much work. For one person. Dad isn't here to help anymore. You could get a good price for the property, maybe buy a nice condo closer to civilization. You could travel, take up hobbies, actually enjoy your retirement. I told her I wasn't ready to retire, that the Desert Rose was my life's work, that the customers were like family to me. She nodded politely, the way you nod at elderly relatives when they're being stubborn about something you think is obvious. She flew back to Los Angeles 3 days later and didn't visit again for 8 months. Over the next few years, our relationship became a series of phone calls where she'd ask pointed questions about my finances, my health, my long-term plans. She'd send articles about women my age who'd suffered injuries from overwork, or statistics about small business failure rates, or real estate listings for retirement communities that looked like prison complexes with better landscaping. Every conversation felt like a gentle but persistent campaign to convince me that I was too old, too tired, too fragile to keep doing what I'd been doing successfully for 3 decades. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. I was working the lunch rush by myself because my usual waitress had called in sick, and the dining room was packed with the construction crew from the new shopping center down the road. I was moving fast, balancing 3 plates on one arm while pouring coffee with the other, the kind of coordinated chaos I'd mastered years ago. That's when Jessica walked in. She'd driven up from Los Angeles without warning, something she'd never done before. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me work, her expression unreadable. She was dressed like she'd come straight from her office, crisp white blouse, tailored blazer, heels that clicked authoritatively against the linoleum floor. She looked like success, like sophistication, like everything I'd worked to provide. For her. She also looked completely out of place. I waved her toward the counter and held up one finger to indicate I'd be with her in a minute. I was in the middle of taking an order from the construction foreman when I heard her sigh loudly behind me. Not just a regular sigh, but the kind of theatrical exhale designed to communicate displeasure. I finished writing down the order, handed it through the kitchen window and turned to face her. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, wiping my hands on my apron. "This is a surprise. What brings you to Henderson?" She looked around the dining room like she was seeing it for the first time, taking in the mismatched chairs, the ceiling fan that wobbled slightly when it rotated, the coffee stains on the laminate counter that I'd never quite been able to scrub out completely. Her nose wrinkled almost imperceptibly, the way it used to when she was a teenager and I'd ask her to help clean the grease traps. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying that crisp, professional tone she used at work. "But not here. Not like this." I told her I couldn't leave in the middle of the lunch rush, that we could talk after closing time if she wanted to stick around. That's when her expression shifted from patient concern to something harder, more frustrated. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, loud enough that several customers turned to look. "You're 62 years old, and you're running around this place like you're still 25. It's embarrassing, Mom. You're embarrassing yourself." The construction foreman at table 3 cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Peterson, who'd been coming in for coffee and pie every Wednesday for 15 years, stopped mid-bite and stared. The entire dining room had gone quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Boulder Highway. I felt heat rise up my neck, but I kept my voice steady. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Jessica, honey, maybe we should talk about this later, when—" "No, Mom. Later never comes with you. You always have an excuse. You're always too busy, always have customers to serve, always have something more important than having an honest conversation with your daughter." She gestured around the room with one manicured hand. "Look at this place. Really look at it. The vinyl is cracked, the paint is peeling, and that ceiling fan has been making that noise for what, 5 years? This isn't success, Mom. This is you. clinging to something that should have ended years ago. I could feel every eye in the restaurant on us, could sense the discomfort radiating from the tables around us. These were my people, my regulars, folks who'd supported me through Robert's death and every challenge since. They didn't deserve to witness this, and neither did I. "Jessica, please," I said quietly. "Let's take this outside." But she was just getting started. "You want to know why I drove all the way up here? Because I'm worried about you. Because I can't stand watching you kill yourself for a business that's barely breaking even, in a building that's falling apart, serving people who probably don't even realize how much you're sacrificing for them." She paused, looking around the room again, and that's when she said it. The words that would echo in my head for weeks afterward. The words that made me realize my own daughter saw me as nothing more than a stubborn old woman playing dress-up in a world she didn't belong in. "Mom, you need to stop acting like you own this place." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 30 years of history pressing down on my shoulders. Every late night I'd spent balancing the books. Every early morning I'd arrived to prep for the breakfast rush. Every sacrifice I'd made to build something lasting. All of it reduced to acting like I belonged in my own life. I looked at my daughter, this beautiful, successful woman I'd raised with everything I had, and realized she had no idea who I really was. She saw me as a relic, a cautionary tale, a woman too proud or too foolish to admit when it was time to give up. She had no idea about the folder of documents in my safe deposit box, the papers that told the real story of the Desert Rose Café and everything I'd built from nothing. "You're right," I said finally, my voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear me. "We do need to talk, but not here." I untied my apron, hung it on the hook behind the register, and asked Tommy, my cook, to handle the front of house for the rest of the day. I grabbed my purse and my keys and I walked outside with Jessica following behind me, her heels clicking against the asphalt parking lot. We sat in her rental car, a sleek silver sedan that still smelled like new leather and air freshener. She turned to face me, her expression softer now, almost apologetic. "Mom, I'm sorry if that came out wrong. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to help you see that you have options. You don't have to keep doing this." I stared out the windshield, at the Desert Rose, at the hand-painted sign Robert had made for me 28 years ago, at the flower boxes I'd installed last spring to make the entrance more welcoming. It looked exactly like what it was, a small-town diner run by people who cared more about community than profit margins. "You think I don't own this place," I said. "Mom, I know you're the manager, and I know you've been here forever, but—" "No, Jessica, you think I don't own this place." She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her trying to process what I was saying. In her mind, I was Michelle Torres, the hard-working single mother who'd scraped by as a waitress and eventually worked her way up to managing someone else's restaurant. I was the woman who'd never gone to college, who'd never had a corporate job, who'd never done anything that looked like success in her world. "Who do you think owns it?" she asked finally. I turned to look at her, this accomplished woman who'd somehow grown up without understanding the most basic facts about her own family's history. "Jessica, honey, what exactly do you think I've been doing here for the past 30 years? The confusion on her face was genuine. In her version of our story, I was the dedicated employee who'd been lucky enough to marry a contractor who helped fix up my boss's restaurant. She'd been so young when it all happened, and I'd been so focused on the day-to-day work of running the business that I'd apparently never explained the most important detail of all. That night, I sat alone in the restaurant after closing, surrounded by the quiet hum of commercial refrigerators and the faint smell of coffee that had soaked into the walls over decades. I thought about Jessica's words, about the way she'd looked at me like I was a child playing pretend in a grown-up world. I thought about Robert, about how proud he'd been when we'd signed the final papers that made the Desert Rose officially ours. I thought about all the documents in my safe deposit box, all the proof of everything we'd built together. Jessica had booked a room at the Hampton Inn for the night. She'd asked if she could stay with me, but I'd told her I needed some time to think. She'd looked hurt, maybe even a little guilty about how the afternoon had gone, but she hadn't apologized. Not really. She'd simply said we'd talk more in the morning, her voice carrying that same professional tone she'd used to dress me down in front of my customers. I locked up the restaurant and drove home to the small house Robert and I had bought 15 years ago, the one with the desert landscaping and the covered patio where we used to sit in the evenings and plan improvements for the restaurant. It felt empty without him, but it also felt like mine in a way that was hard to explain. Every tile, every light fixture, every paint color had been chosen by us, paid for with money we'd earned together at the Desert Rose. The safe deposit box key was in my jewelry box, tucked behind the earrings Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. I hadn't looked at those papers in years, not since the insurance company had needed copies after Robert's death, but I knew they were there. Every document that proved the story Jessica didn't know, the truth about who really built the Desert Rose Café and why I didn't just act like I owned it. That night, I made a decision. I was going to show Jessica exactly who she'd been talking to, exactly whose life she'd been trying to reorganize. But I wasn't going to do it in anger, and I wasn't going to do it alone. If she wanted a family, meeting to discuss my future, then that's exactly what she was going to get. I picked up the phone and started making calls. Jessica called me at 7 in the morning, her voice crisp and businesslike, as if yesterday's confrontation had been just another agenda item to check off her list. She wanted to meet for breakfast, somewhere neutral, she said. Somewhere we could have a productive conversation without distractions. I suggested the IHOP on Sunset Road, knowing full well she'd hate everything about it. The sticky syrup dispensers, the fluorescent lighting, the way the servers called everyone honey and took their time refilling coffee cups. She arrived 15 minutes late, her hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail that probably took longer to achieve than I spent getting ready for an entire day. She slid into the booth across from me, eyeing the laminated menu with the same expression she'd worn when looking around the Desert Rose. Distaste mixed with resignation, like someone forced to eat cafeteria food when they were accustomed to fine dining. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," she began, not bothering with small talk or apologies. "I may have been too direct, but the message stands. You're working yourself into an early grave for a business that's never going to give you the security you need for retirement." I sipped my coffee and waited for her to continue. I'd learned long ago that Jessica liked to present her arguments in full before allowing any interruption, a habit she'd probably picked up in those corporate boardrooms where she spent her days convincing people to buy things they didn't need. "I've done some research," she continued, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what looked like a prepared presentation. "The average sale price for restaurant properties in Henderson has increased by 37% in the last 5 years. If you sold now, you could probably get enough to buy a nice condo and have money left over for travel, hobbies, whatever you want to do with your golden years." The waitress came by to refill our cups, and Jessica barely acknowledged her presence. She just kept talking, outlining her vision of my future like she was describing a vacation package. Easy, convenient, and completely disconnected from anything I actually wanted. "I've also been looking into assisted living communities in the area," she said, swiping to another screen. "Not that you need assistance now, of course, but it's smart to plan ahead. There's a beautiful place in Summerlin with a golf course, and an arts and crafts center. They even have a small restaurant where you could probably get a part-time job if you missed working in food service." I set down my coffee cup carefully, the ceramic making a soft clink against the saucer. "A part-time job in food service. Well, yes, if you wanted to stay involved in that world. Though, honestly, Mom, after 30 years of being on your feet all day, I'd think you'd want to try something new. They have book clubs, bridge tournaments, water aerobics. You could finally have a social life that doesn't revolve around customers and coffee orders. The condescension in her voice was so casual, so automatic, that I wondered if she even heard it herself. She was talking about my life's work like it was a phase I'd grown out of, like being a restaurant owner was something embarrassing I'd done in my youth before I came to my senses. Jessica, what do you think I did before the Desert Rose? She looked up from her phone, momentarily confused by the question. You worked at Mickey's Diner. You were a waitress. And before that? I don't know. You were young when you had me. I assume you worked wherever you could find a job. I nodded, slowly, watching her face as she tried to understand why I was asking. She had the basic outline of my story, the simplified version she'd absorbed as a child, but she'd never bothered to fill in the details. She knew I'd struggled, knew Robert had helped us, knew we'd eventually achieved some measure of stability. But she'd never asked about the specifics, never wondered about the steps between point A and point B. Tell me what you remember about the early days at the Desert Rose, I said. She shrugged, still focused on her phone. You worked there, you married Robert, he helped you fix the place up. It was always kind of run down, but you made it work. Who owned it when I started working there? Mickey something. Mickey Rodriguez? You always talked about him like he was this sweet old man who took a chance on you. Mickey Castellanos, I corrected. And yes, he did take a chance on me. But what happened when Mickey decided to retire? Jessica looked up again, this time with a flash of impatience. Mom, I don't understand why we're going through ancient history. The point is that you're working too hard now, at an age when you should be slowing down. The point, Jessica, is that you're making assumptions about my life based on incomplete information. She set her phone down with a small sigh, the kind of sound she probably made in meetings when colleagues asked questions she considered irrelevant. Okay, fine. What happened when Mickey retired? He offered to sell me the business. Right, and you couldn't afford it, so you stayed on as manager when the new owners took over. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to understand how she'd constructed this version of events in her mind. It wasn't completely wrong, but it was missing the most important details, the ones that changed everything about what the Desert Rose meant to our family. No, Jessica, I bought it. She blinked, her perfectly applied mascara framing eyes that looked genuinely confused. You bought what? The business, the building, the property. All of it. That's impossible. You didn't have that kind of money. I had $700 in savings and a dream that everyone told me was too big. Mickey carried the note for the first 2 years because he believed in me. Robert co-signed the loan when we got married, but the business was mine before I ever met him. Jessica stared at me like I'd just claimed to be a secret astronaut. In her mind, I was Michelle Torres, the woman who'd worked her way up from waitress to manager through sheer persistence and loyalty. The idea that I might have been an entrepreneur, a risk-taker, a business owner who'd built something from nothing, that didn't fit with the narrative she'd created about her simple, hard-working mother. You're telling me you've owned the Desert Rose this whole time? For 31 years next month. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. I could see her trying to reconcile what I'd just told her with everything she thought she knew about our family's history. The wheels were turning, but slowly, like a computer trying to run software it wasn't equipped to handle. Why didn't you ever tell me this? I thought you knew. You grew up there, Jessica. You saw me making the decisions, handling the vendors, dealing with the landlord issues and the permit renewals. You watched me hire and fire employees, negotiate with suppliers, design the menu changes. What did you think I was doing? I thought you were just really dedicated to your job. The honesty in her voice almost broke my heart. She'd spent her entire adult life thinking of me as an employee, someone who worked hard but never owned anything, never built anything, never accomplished anything that counted in her world of corporate success and professional achievement. Jessica, do you remember when you wanted to take that photography class in high school? The expensive one at the community college? Vaguely. You said you couldn't ask me for the money because you knew we didn't have it. So I worked extra shifts for 2 months to pay for it. I remember you working a lot. You always worked a lot. I wasn't working extra shifts at someone else's restaurant, honey. I was working extra hours at my own business, putting every spare dollar towards your photography class, because I wanted you to have opportunities I never had. She was staring at her untouched pancakes now, syrup congealing in sticky pools while she tried to absorb what I was telling her. I could see her going back through years of memories, re-examining conversations and assumptions through this new lens. When you graduated from college, I continued, and you wanted to move to Los Angeles but didn't have money for a security deposit, where do you think that $2,000 came from? I assumed you'd saved it somehow. I had saved. It's in the business account, from profits I'd earned running my own restaurant. The silence stretched between us, filled with the ambient noise of other breakfast conversations, the clatter of plates being cleared, the hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. Jessica looked smaller somehow, her confident posture deflated as she realized how completely she'd misunderstood her own family's story. I don't understand, she said finally. If you owned the business, why didn't you ever act like it? Why didn't you have an office or wear nice clothes or drive a better car? Because I was building something, Jessica. Every dollar I didn't spend on myself went back into the business or into your future. I didn't need an office because I preferred being on the floor with my customers. I didn't need expensive clothes because they would have been impractical for the work I was doing. And I drove reliable cars because reliability mattered more than status when I was responsible for getting to work every day to run my business. She pushed her plate away, appetite apparently gone. This changes everything. Does it? Because, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you still think I should sell everything I've built and move into a retirement community so I can play bridge with people I don't know and take water aerobics classes I don't want. No, that's not. She stopped, realizing that's exactly what she'd been proposing. I just thought you deserved better than working so hard for so little return. Little return? Jessica, I put you through college debt-free with money I earned from that restaurant. I paid for your car, your apartment deposits, your professional wardrobe when you started your first job. I've employed dozens of people over the years, many of them single mothers like I was, giving them steady work and flexible schedules when they needed to take care of their kids. I've fed thousands of people, provided a gathering place for our community, and built something that will outlast me. What part of that feels like little return to you? She was crying now. Not the dramatic sobs of someone having a breakdown, but the quiet tears of someone realizing they'd been fundamentally wrong about something important. She wiped her eyes with a paper napkin, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know. I should have known, but I didn't. You didn't know because you never asked. You assumed you understood my life based on what it looked like from the outside, without bothering to learn the details. You're right. I've been treating you like you're incapable of making your own decisions, like you need me to swoop in and save you from yourself. But if you own the business, if you built all of this, then yesterday must have been. She stopped, the full implications of her public criticism finally hitting her. Yesterday was my daughter telling me I was embarrassing myself by acting like I owned my own restaurant, in front of customers who've known me for decades and employees who depend on me for their livelihood. Jessica covered her face with her hands. Oh, God. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought I was helping. You thought you were managing a problem. You saw me as a stubborn old woman who needed to be convinced to make sensible choices about her life. That's not how I see you. Isn't it? You flew up here without warning, criticized my life choices in front of my customers, and presented me with research about retirement communities like I'm too senile to make my own decisions. You talked about my life's work like it's a hobby I've outgrown. She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the parking lot where heat waves were already shimmering off the asphalt despite the early hour. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, younger sounding than the confident professional tone she'd been using. I was embarrassed, she admitted. Of what? Of you, of the restaurant, of the fact that my friends in LA have mothers who are retired executives or doctors or professors, and my mom runs a diner in Nevada. I wanted better for you because I was ashamed that what you had wasn't good enough. The honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected as much, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that was hard to process. My daughter was ashamed of me, of the life I'd built, of the work I was proud of. Jessica, do you know what I was doing when you were 8 years old and I bought the Desert Rose? She shook her head. I was trying to build something that would give us security, something that would let me be my own boss so I could be there for you when you needed me. I was creating a legacy, a business I could pass down to you if you ever wanted it. I never wanted it. I know that now, but at the time, I thought I was building our future together. I thought you'd be proud of what we accomplished. Jessica reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers cold despite the desert heat outside. I am proud of you, Mom. I just didn't understand what there was to be proud of. And now, that you do understand. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Now I feel like an idiot for trying to solve problems that didn't exist. But I also feel like I don't know you at all. You're not the person I thought you were. I'm exactly the person I've always been, Jessica. You just never bothered to look closely enough to see me. The drive back to the Desert Rose was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Jessica followed me in her rental car, and I found myself wondering what she was thinking as she looked at the building with new eyes. Did it look different to her now, knowing that every improvement, every repair, every small detail had been my decision? Did the faded paint and worn vinyl suddenly seem like the marks of ownership rather than neglect? We sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after we arrived, neither of us eager to go inside and face the customers who'd witnessed yesterday's confrontation. Finally, Jessica got out of her car and walked over to mine. Can I see them? She asked through my window. See what? The papers. The proof that you own this place. I know it sounds terrible, but I need to see it to really believe it. I understood. It was one thing to hear the story, another thing entirely to see the documentation that made it real. I'd felt the same way when Mickey first offered to sell me the business. I couldn't quite believe it was possible until I saw my name on the paperwork. They're in a safe deposit box at the bank. We can go there after lunch if you want. I want. We went inside together, and I was relieved to see that the breakfast crowd was lighter than usual. Tommy was working the grill, and Maria, my most reliable waitress, was handling the tables with her usual efficiency. A few customers looked up when we entered, their expressions curious but not hostile. These were good people, folks who'd probably already forgotten about yesterday's drama or chalked it up to family stress. Jessica sat at the counter while I checked in with Tommy about inventory and reviewed the orders that had come in overnight. I moved through my usual routines, and I could feel her watching me, studying the way I interacted with employees, the casual authority in my voice when I made decisions about scheduling and menu changes. Mrs. Torres, Maria called from the coffee station, Table 6 wants to know if you can make that special omelet you did for them last week, the one with the green chilies. Of course, I called back. Tell them I'll have it right out. Jessica raised an eyebrow. You cook too? When needed. I've worn every hat in this place at one time or another. She nodded slowly, like she was cataloging each new piece of information, building a more complete picture of who I actually was. It was strange, being observed so intently by my own daughter, like she was meeting me for the first time. The lunch rush was manageable, and by 2 o'clock the dining room had cleared enough that I felt comfortable leaving Maria in charge. Jessica and I drove to the bank in my car, her rental following behind us like a silver shadow. The safe deposit box was in the vault at Desert Community Bank, the same institution that had given me my first business loan 31 years ago. The loan officer who'd approved my original application, Mr. Henderson, had retired years ago, but his nameplate still sat on the desk of his replacement, a young woman who couldn't have been much older than Jessica. I signed the forms and showed my identification, the familiar ritual of accessing the metal box that held the most important documents of my life. Jessica stood beside me as I lifted the lid, revealing neat stacks of papers organized in manila folders. "This is the original purchase agreement," I said, handing her the first document. Mickey's signature, my signature, the date of sale. She examined it carefully, her eyes moving over every line like she was searching for evidence of forgery. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see her absorbing the reality of my name on the buyer's line, the dollar amounts, the terms of the agreement. "These are the business licenses," I continued, pulling out another folder. "Updated every year for 3 decades, and here's the property deed, showing ownership of the building and the land it sits on." Jessica held the deed in her hands like it was made of delicate crystal. "Michelle Elena Torres," she read aloud. "Sole proprietor." "That's me." "This is dated 2 years before you married Robert." "That's right. He helped me improve the business, but he never owned any part of it. We kept our finances separate so there would never be any question about whose dream the Desert Rose represented." She looked through more documents, tax records, insurance policies, permits for the kitchen expansion, licenses for the outdoor seating I'd added 5 years ago. Each piece of paper told part of the story of what I'd built, the bureaucratic trail of a small business owner who'd navigated every regulation and requirement without the benefit of an MBA or a corporate background. "Mom," she said finally, her voice very quiet, "I owe you an enormous apology. You owe me more than that." She looked up sharply, and I could see her preparing for another lecture, another list of her mistakes and shortcomings. But that wasn't what I had in mind. "You owe me the chance to see me clearly, to understand who I really am instead of who you assumed I was. You owe me the respect of asking questions instead of making assumptions. And you owe me the courtesy of trusting that I'm capable of making good decisions about my own life." Jessica nodded, tears starting again. "You're right. I've been terrible. You've been uninformed. There's a difference." We put the documents back in their folders and returned them to the safe deposit box. Walking out of the bank, Jessica was unusually quiet, her usual confident stride replaced by something more hesitant. "What happens now?" she asked as we reached the parking lot. "Now you go back to Los Angeles and think about what you've learned, and I go back to running my business." "That's it? What were you expecting?" "I don't know. A bigger confrontation, maybe. More anger. You have every right to be furious with me." I stopped walking and turned to face her. The afternoon sun was brutal, the kind of heat that makes everything shimmer and dance in the distance. Jessica's face was flushed, and not just from the temperature. "Jessica, I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. There's a difference." "Disappointed how?" "I'm disappointed that you've lived your entire adult life without understanding what your mother actually accomplished. I'm disappointed that you were embarrassed by the work that paid for your education and your opportunities. I'm disappointed that you thought so little of my intelligence and judgment that you believed I needed you to save me from my own choices." She absorbed this quietly, her eyes focused on the asphalt at our feet. "But mostly," I continued, "I'm disappointed that we've wasted so much time. You're my daughter, Jessica. I love you more than anything in this world, but I can't have a real relationship with someone who doesn't know who I am. I want to know who you are. Then start asking questions instead of giving advice. Start listening instead of lecturing. And start trusting that a woman who built a successful business from nothing might just know what she's doing with her own life. Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm going to do better, Mom. I promise. I hope so. Because tomorrow I'm having a family meeting of my own, and you're going to learn just how many people understand exactly who I am and what I've accomplished. The confusion on her face was almost comical. What kind of family meeting? The kind where my real family, the people who've supported me and believed in me for 30 years, get to hear the truth about what happened yesterday. The kind where you get to apologize not just to me but to the community you insulted. Jessica paled. Mom, I don't think that's necessary. It's absolutely necessary. You made a public scene, Jessica. You embarrassed me in front of people who respect me, people who've watched me build something meaningful in this town. If you want to repair the damage you've done, you're going to have to do it publicly. What if I refuse? I looked at her steadily. This accomplished woman who still thought she could negotiate her way out of taking responsibility for her actions. Then you go back to Los Angeles with the same incomplete understanding of our relationship that you came with. Your choice. She was quiet for a long moment, probably weighing her options, calculating the personal and professional cost of admitting she'd been wrong in front of a room full of strangers. What exactly would I have to do? Show up. Listen, acknowledge what you've learned, and let the people who've been part of my journey for 30 years see that my daughter finally understands who her mother really is. Jessica took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening as she made her decision. Okay, I'll do it. Good, because I've already made the calls. That evening, after Jessica had returned to her hotel room to make phone calls and rearrange her flight schedule, I sat alone in the Desert Rose with a cup of coffee and my old address book. The restaurant felt different in the quiet hours after closing, when the chairs were stacked on tables and the floors gleamed from their nightly mopping. This was when I did my best thinking, when the space belonged entirely to me, and I could hear myself breathe. I opened the worn leather address book that I'd been keeping since the early days, its pages filled with the names and numbers of people who'd been part of the Desert Rose story from the beginning. Suppliers who'd extended credit when money was tight. Customers who'd become friends, then family. Employees who'd stayed for years, watching their children grow up in the corner booths while they worked. Former employees who'd moved on to other jobs, but still stopped by for coffee and conversation. This was my real family, the network of relationships I'd built one interaction at a time over 3 decades. I started with Maria Santos, my head waitress who'd been with me for 12 years. Maria had started as a single mother trying to support 2 kids on minimum wage and tips. Now her oldest was in college on a partial scholarship, and her youngest was a junior in high school with plans to study engineering. Maria had keys to the restaurant and could run the place as well as I could when I was out sick or taking one of my rare vacation days. Mrs. Torres? Maria's voice was concerned when she answered the phone. Is everything okay? You never call this late. I'm fine, Maria, but I need to ask you a favor. Tomorrow evening, after we close, I'd like you to stay for a special meeting. I'll pay you overtime, of course. What kind of meeting? I explained what had happened with Jessica, how she'd publicly criticized me without understanding that I owned the business she was disparaging. Maria listened without interruption, but I could hear her breathing getting faster as I described the scene in the dining room. She said what? Maria's voice was sharp with indignation. Mrs. Torres, that girl has no idea what she's talking about. I've watched you build this place into something special. I've seen you stay up all night when the health inspector was coming, seen you work through the flu because you didn't want to let your customers down. How dare she act like you don't belong here? She didn't know, Maria. She's been living in a different world, seeing me through a lens that filtered out all the important details. That's no excuse for disrespecting you in front of everyone. Some of those people have been coming here since before she was born. Which is why I'm calling you. I want to set the record straight, not just for Jessica, but for everyone who witnessed that confrontation. I want them to hear the real story, to understand exactly what they saw yesterday. Maria was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her thinking. You want me to help you put together something that shows her who you really are. I want you to help me remind everyone who I really am, including myself, if I'm being honest. Count me in. What do you need? I asked Maria to call the other current employees, to invite them to stay after closing tomorrow for what I described as a celebration of the Desert Rose's history. I didn't want to give away too much over the phone, but I wanted them to understand that their presence would mean something important. Next, I called Tommy Reeves, my cook, and the closest thing I had to a business partner. Tommy had been with me for 8 years, ever since his previous restaurant job ended when the owner retired. He was in his 50s, a quiet man who took pride in his work and never complained about the long hours or demanding customers. Tommy had a gift for reading people, for knowing exactly what they needed even when they didn't know how to ask for it. Michelle, he said when he heard my voice, I was hoping you'd call. I wanted to check on you after what happened today. That was rough. It was a misunderstanding, Tommy, a big one, but I'm going to fix it tomorrow night, and I need your help. Whatever you need. I explained my plan, and Tommy listened with the same careful attention he brought to everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. You know what I've always admired about you, Michelle? You never let anyone define. You accept yourself. Tomorrow night sounds like a good time to remind people of that. Will you help me with the food? I want to do this right. Already thinking about it. Leave the menu to me. The next call was harder. I dialed the number for Pete Castellanos, Mickey's nephew, who'd helped with the original sale of the restaurant and had stayed in touch over the years. Pete was a retired contractor who understood the business side of what I'd accomplished, the permits and inspections and negotiations that most people never saw. Michelle, good to hear from you. How's business? Business is good, Pete, but I need a favor. I'm having a gathering tomorrow night, kind of a celebration, and I'd like you to be there. I want people to hear the story of how the Desert Rose came to be, from someone who was there for the beginning. Mickey's story about selling to the crazy lady with $700 and a dream? Pete chuckled. That's one of my favorite stories. He used to tell it every Christmas, how he knew you'd make something special of that place, even when everyone else thought he was nuts for carrying the note. That's the one. Can you make it tomorrow around 7? Wouldn't miss it. Should I bring anything? Just your memory and your voice. I have a feeling people are going to need to hear some truths they haven't heard before. I worked my way through the address book, calling customers who'd become friends, former employees who'd moved on but still cared about the Desert Rose, community members who'd supported me through the years. Each conversation was different, but the response was always the same. People were excited to come, curious about what I had planned, and more than a little protective when I explained what had happened with Jessica. Mrs. Chen, who'd been coming in for coffee and pie every Tuesday for 15 years, was particularly vocal. That daughter of yours needs to learn some respect. You've been nothing but good to this community, Michelle. We've all watched you work yourself to the bone to make this place special. She's learning, Mrs. Chen. Tomorrow night is part of that education. Good. It's about time. By 10 o'clock, I'd made 23 phone calls and received 23 commitments to attend. Word was already spreading through the network of relationships I'd built over the years. Maria called me back to say that several customers had approached her during her shift, asking if they could come to whatever I was planning. The Desert Rose family was circling the wagons, and I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee I was drinking. The last call I made was to my lawyer, Janet Morrison, who'd handled the legal aspects of my business for the past decade. Janet was a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in small business law and had helped me navigate everything from employment issues to contract disputes. Michelle, this is a surprise. What's going on? I explained the situation with Jessica, the misunderstanding about ownership, and my plan for tomorrow's gathering. Janet listened with the careful attention of someone who understood the legal implications of what I was describing. You want me to be there as a witness to the actual ownership structure? I want you to be there as someone who can speak to what it takes to build and maintain a business like this. Jessica sees me as someone who's been playing restaurant for 30 years. I want her to understand the legal and financial complexity of what I've actually accomplished. I'll bring copies of some of the documents I've prepared for you over the years, the incorporation papers, the property transfers, the tax filings. Sometimes people need to see official paperwork to understand that business ownership is real, not just a hobby. Thank you, Janet. This means a lot. Michelle, I've been working with small business owners for 20 years, and I can count on one hand the number of people who've built something as solid and lasting as what you've created. Your daughter needs to understand that she's not dealing with someone who stumbled into success. You're a businesswoman who's earned every bit of respect you've received. After I hung up with Janet, I sat in the quiet restaurant for another hour, planning exactly how tomorrow's gathering would unfold. I wanted it to be educational, not vindictive. I wanted Jessica to understand not just that she'd been wrong, but why her assumptions had been so far off base. Most importantly, I wanted her to see me through the eyes of people who'd watched me build something meaningful from nothing. I walked through the dining room, straightening chairs and wiping tables that were already clean. In the corner booth where Jessica used to do her homework, I found myself remembering the little girl who'd been so proud of her mother's work, who'd bragged to her friends about how her mom made the best pancakes in Nevada. Somewhere along the way, that pride had turned to embarrassment, and I'd been too busy running the business to notice when it happened. The next morning came too quickly. I arrived at the Desert Rose at 5:30, an hour earlier than usual, wanting extra time to prepare for what felt like the most important day in the restaurant's history. I made coffee in the large pot we used for catering, enough to serve the crowd I was expecting. I reviewed the menu Tommy had planned for the evening. Nothing fancy, just the comfort food the Desert Rose was known for, prepared with the kind of care that had built our reputation. Jessica arrived at 9, looking nervous and underdressed in jeans and a simple blouse. She'd left her professional armor at the hotel, which I took as a good sign. She sat at the counter and accepted a cup of coffee without her usual critiques about the quality or temperature. "I've been thinking about yesterday," she said quietly, "about everything you told me. I keep trying to figure out how I got it so wrong for so long." "You got it wrong because you weren't paying attention. You assumed you understood my life based on what you could see from a distance, without bothering to ask questions or learn details. I was so focused on what I thought you should be doing that I never stopped to understand what you were actually doing." The breakfast rush was lighter than usual, which gave me time to observe Jessica as she watched me work. I could see her noticing things she'd missed before, the way regular customers asked for my opinion on menu choices, the deference in Tommy's voice when he asked about special orders, the casual authority I displayed when handling vendor calls, and scheduling decisions. Around 11, she asked if she could help with anything. I handed her a rag and pointed to the coffee station that needed cleaning. She worked quietly, methodically, her movements careful and deliberate. It was the first time in years that she'd done physical work in the restaurant, and I could see her remembering the muscle memory from her teenage years. "This is harder than I remembered," she said, wiping down the espresso machine. "Most things are harder than they look from the outside." At noon, Maria arrived for her shift and greeted Jessica politely but coolly. I could tell Maria was reserving judgment, waiting to see how Jessica handled herself during the evening's gathering. Other employees trickled in throughout the afternoon, and I noticed them watching Jessica with curious eyes, probably wondering if this was the daughter who'd caused such a scene the day before. By 4 o'clock, the regular dinner crowd was beginning to arrive, and I could sense an unusual energy in the air. Word had spread through the community that something special was happening at the Desert Rose tonight, and several customers lingered longer than usual, asking quiet questions about what time they should return. Jessica helped with small tasks throughout the day, refilling napkin dispensers, rolling silverware, organizing menus. She didn't complain about the repetitive work or the industrial smell of commercial dishwashing soap. She was beginning to understand that running a restaurant required attention to 1,000 small details, that the polished experience customers enjoyed was built on hours of unglamorous preparation. At 6 o'clock, I closed the restaurant to regular customers and began preparing for the evening's gathering. Tommy had outdone himself with the food, platters of the Desert Rose's most popular dishes, arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for wedding receptions. The coffee was fresh and strong, and Maria had set up the dining room with chairs arranged in a loose circle, creating an intimate atmosphere that encouraged conversation. People began arriving at 6:30, earlier than the 7 o'clock start, time I'd announced. Pete Castellanos came first, carrying a manila folder that I suspected contained documents from the original sale 30 years ago. Mrs. Chen arrived with her husband, both of them dressed as if they were attending church. Maria's teenage daughter, Sophia, came with her mother, having heard the story and wanting to see the woman who'd given her family stability and opportunity. By 7 o'clock, 42 people had gathered in the Desert Rose dining room. Current and former employees sat next to longtime customers. Community members who'd supported me through difficult times shared space with business associates who understood the complexities of small business ownership. Janet Morrison sat near the front, her briefcase full of documents that told the legal story of what I'd built. Jessica stood near the kitchen door, looking overwhelmed by the turnout. I could see her calculating the relationships in the room, trying to understand how one person could have touched so many lives through the simple act of running a restaurant. This was her first real glimpse into the community I'd built, the network of people who saw me not as a tired old woman clinging to the past, but as someone who'd created something meaningful and lasting. I stood in the center of the room, looking around at faces that represented 30 years of shared history. These were the people who'd celebrated with me when business was good, supported me when times were tough, and believed in the Desert Rose even when I doubted myself. They were my chosen family, the relationships that had sustained me through Robert's death and every challenge since. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt looking at this gathering. "Most of you know, my daughter Jessica, though you might remember her better as the little girl who used to do her homework in booth number 6. Jessica managed a small wave, her face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been pride. Yesterday, Jessica and I had a conversation that made me realize how much of the Desert Rose story has never been properly told. Not just to her, but to many of you who've been part of this journey from the beginning. Tonight, I want to share that story, not because I need validation, but because Jessica needs to understand what she witnessed yesterday when she told me to stop acting like I owned this place. A murmur ran through the room, and I could see people shifting in their seats, preparing to defend me if necessary. But that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted understanding, not conflict. I want to start with Pete Castellanos, who was there on the day I signed the papers to buy this business from his uncle Mickey. "Pete, can you tell everyone what this place was like 31 years ago, and what it took to transform it into what you see today?" Pete stood slowly, his weathered hands holding the manila folder I'd noticed when he arrived. "Folks, I've been in construction for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of people with big dreams and small bank accounts. Most of them fail within the first year because they don't understand what it takes to build something from nothing." He opened his folder and pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age. "This is what the Desert Rose looked like when Mickey decided to sell. The roof leaked, the plumbing was shot, and the kitchen equipment was held together with duct tape and prayer. Mickey had let the place run down in his final years, and most potential buyers took one look and walked away. Pete passed the photograph around the room, and I watched people's faces as they saw the before picture of the building that had become such an important part of their lives. Michelle Torres was different, Pete continued. She didn't see a rundown diner with expensive problems. She saw potential. She had a vision of what this place could become, and more importantly, she had the determination to make it happen. But vision and determination don't pay for new plumbing and roof repairs. He pulled out more documents from his folder. These are copies of the original purchase agreement and renovation contracts. Michelle didn't just buy a business, folks. She bought a construction project that would have bankrupted most people. And she did it with $700 in savings and a payment plan that required her to make the business profitable enough to cover both operating expenses and renovation costs. Jessica was listening intently, her eyes moving between Pete and the documents he was passing around. I could see her beginning to understand the magnitude of what I'd taken on. The financial risk and personal commitment required to transform a failing business into a community institution. I watched Michelle work 18-hour days during those first 2 years, Pete said. She'd serve customers during business hours, then put on work clothes and help with the renovation after closing. She learned to install tile, paint walls, and repair equipment because she couldn't afford to hire professionals for everything. The woman rebuilt this place with her own hands, one project at a time. Mrs. Chen raised her hand. Pete, how long? Did it take before the restaurant started making a real profit? Good question. Michelle, you want to answer that one? I stood again, feeling the weight of 42 pairs of eyes focused on me. It took 4 years before I drew a salary. That was above minimum wage. Everything I earned in those early years went back into the business or into Jessica's future. I lived on tips and whatever was left over after paying employees and suppliers. But you never missed a payment to Mickey, Pete added. Never asked for an extension or special consideration. You met every obligation exactly as agreed, even when it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner and wearing the same 3 work uniforms until they fell apart. Janet Morrison stood next. I'd like to add some perspective from the legal and financial side. Michelle, may I share what I brought? I nodded, and Janet opened her briefcase. I've been Michelle's attorney for 10 years, but these documents go back much further. What you're looking at is the paper trail of a business owner who's navigated every legal requirement, every tax obligation, every regulatory change that's affected small businesses over the past 3 decades. She held up a thick folder. Business licenses updated annually. Health department certifications, always in perfect compliance. Tax returns showing steady growth and responsible financial management. Employment records demonstrating fair wages and benefits for dozens of workers over the years. This isn't the paperwork of someone who's been playing restaurant, folks. This is the documentation of a serious businesswoman who's built something substantial and lasting. Maria Santos stood up from her seat near the kitchen. If I may, I'd like to say something about what it's like to work for Michelle. I nodded, curious to hear what Maria would share. I came to work here 12 years ago as a single mother with 2 kids and no prospects. I'd been fired from my previous job for missing too many days when my children were sick. Michelle hired me despite my spotty work history, and more than that, she created a schedule that allowed me to be a mother first and an employee second. Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued. When my son needed surgery and I couldn't afford the time off, Michelle covered my shifts herself and continued paying my full wages. When my daughter was struggling in school, Michelle helped her with homework during slow periods and connected us with tutoring resources. This woman didn't just give me a job, she gave me a chance to build a life for my family. Other employees began sharing similar stories. Tommy talked about how I'd hired him when other restaurants wouldn't consider someone his age. Carlos, a former busboy who now managed a restaurant in Las Vegas, spoke about the recommendation letter I'd written that helped him get his current job. Sophia, Maria's daughter, thanked me for creating a workplace where she'd learned responsibility. and work ethic while saving money for college. Customer after customer stood to share memories of celebrations held at the Desert Rose, of comfort found in familiar surroundings during difficult times, of the sense of community I'd fostered by remembering names and preferences and personal details. Mrs. Chen talked about how I'd stayed open late the night her husband had been in the hospital, making sure she had somewhere warm to wait for news. Another customer described how I'd catered her daughter's wedding reception at cost because I knew money was tight. As the stories accumulated, I watched Jessica's expression change from embarrassment to amazement to something approaching awe. She was seeing me through the eyes of people whose lives I'd touched, understanding for the first time the scope of what the Desert Rose represented in our community. Finally, I stood to speak again. "Jessica, you asked me yesterday why I don't act more like a business owner, why I don't have an office or wear expensive clothes or drive a luxury car. These stories are your answer. Every dollar I didn't spend on status symbols went into creating opportunities for people like Maria and Tommy and Carlos. Every hour I spent working on the floor instead of sitting in an office was an hour spent building relationships with customers who became family." I gestured around the room. "This is what ownership looks like when it's done right. Not just legal documents and profit margins, but a web of relationships and responsibilities that extend far beyond the building itself. You see me as someone who's worked too long for too little reward, but these people understand that the reward isn't just financial. It's the knowledge that you've created something that matters, something that makes other people's lives better." Jessica was crying now, not the quiet tears of yesterday, but the deep sobs of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of their mistake. She stood slowly, looking around the room at faces that were kind but expectant. "I owe all of you an apology," she said, her voice shaking. "I came here thinking I needed to save my mother from a life that was beneath her, and instead I discovered that she's built something I never even tried to understand. I was embarrassed by work that I should have been proud of, ashamed of accomplishments that deserved celebration." She turned to face me directly. "Mom, I'm sorry for treating you like you were incapable of making good decisions about your own life. I'm sorry for criticizing you in front of people who respect and care about you. And I'm sorry for spending 30 years being too self-absorbed to see what an amazing woman you really are." The room was quiet, except for the sound of Jessica's crying and the gentle murmur of people shifting in their chairs. I walked over to my daughter and took her hands in mine. "Jessica, the only thing I've ever wanted from you is for you to see me clearly. Not as perfect, not as a saint, but as a real person who's worked hard and made sacrifices and built something meaningful. Today, finally, you do see me. That's all I've ever needed." The gathering continued for another hour, with people sharing more stories and Jessica asking questions about the business, the community, and the choices I'd made over the years. By the time the last guest left, it was nearly 10 o'clock, and the dining room felt warm with the afterglow of shared understanding. Jessica helped clean up, working alongside Maria and Tommy and me as we restored the restaurant to its usual order. She moved with more confidence now, comfortable in the space in a way she hadn't been since childhood. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked as we finished stacking chairs. "Tomorrow I get up at 5:30 and open the restaurant for breakfast, just like I have for 31 years. And me? You go back to Los Angeles with a better understanding of who your mother is and what she's accomplished. And maybe, if you want, you start calling more often and asking better questions about my life." Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes with a dish towel. "I love you, Mom. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago." "You're saying it now. That's what matters." As we prepared to leave, Jessica turned back to look at the dining room one more time. "It's beautiful, Mom. I never noticed before, but it really is beautiful." I followed her gaze, seeing the Desert Rose through her eyes. Not as a tired old diner that needed updating, but as a gathering place that had been lovingly maintained and thoughtfully improved over 3 decades. Every detail told a story. Every corner held memories. Every table had hosted conversations that mattered to the people who'd shared them. "Yes," I said quietly. "It is beautiful. And tomorrow, I get to make it beautiful all over again." 3. Months later, Jessica surprised me with another unannounced visit. This time, however, she didn't arrive with the crisp confidence of someone coming to solve problems. She pulled into the Desert Rose parking lot on a Thursday afternoon in June, driving a dusty sedan instead of a rental car, wearing jeans and sneakers instead of her usual professional armor. When she walked through the front door, she looked nervous, almost shy, like a teenager asking for permission to join a conversation she wasn't sure she belonged in. I was behind the counter, reviewing invoices with Maria, when I noticed her standing awkwardly near the hostess station. The lunch rush had ended, and the dining room held only a few lingering customers nursing coffee and splitting pieces of pie. Jessica scanned the familiar space with new eyes, taking in details she'd overlooked for years. The way afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows I had cleaned just that morning. The fresh flowers Tommy had picked up from the farmer's market. The photos on the walls showing 3 decades of Desert Rose history. "Hi, Mom," she said when I approached, her voice uncertain. "I hope this is okay. I should have called first." "You're always welcome here, Jessica. You know that." She nodded, but I could see tension in her shoulders. The kind of nervousness that comes from wanting something badly and not knowing how to ask for it. She glanced around the dining room again, noting the customers who looked up with friendly curiosity, recognizing her as my daughter, but sensing something different about this visit. "Could we talk?" she asked. "I mean, when you have time. I know you're working." "Of course. Let me finish up with Maria, and then we can sit." I completed the invoice review quickly, aware that Jessica was watching me work with the same intense focus she'd shown during her last visit. But this time, her attention felt different, less judgmental, more genuinely curious about the mechanics of running a business. When I gestured toward booth 6, the corner table where she'd spent so many childhood afternoons, she slid into the seat with visible relief. "Coffee?" I asked, and she nodded gratefully. I poured 2 cups from the fresh pot and settled across from her, noting the way she wrapped her hands around the ceramic mug as if drawing comfort from its warmth. The Jessica sitting across from me looked younger somehow, less polished, more vulnerable than the corporate executive who'd criticized my life choices 3 months ago. "I've been thinking," she began, then stopped, apparently struggling with how to continue. "Actually, that's not true. I've been obsessing about what happened here, about what I learned about you, about how wrong I was about everything." She paused to sip her coffee, and I waited patiently, recognizing the careful way she was choosing her words. "I went back to Los Angeles after that gathering, and I tried to go back to my normal routine. But everything felt different. My job, my apartment, my entire life. It all felt hollow somehow. I kept thinking about what you said, about building. Something that matters, about creating relationships instead of just pursuing profit." Jessica set down her cup and looked directly at me. "I quit my job, Mom." This wasn't what I'd expected to hear. "You quit? Jessica? You've worked so hard to build your career. Was it because of what happened here?" "Partly, but mostly it was. Because I realized I was spending my life helping rich people buy things they don't need while ignoring the most impressive entrepreneur I've ever known." She gestured around the dining room. "You built this from nothing, Mom. You created jobs, supported families, became a cornerstone of your community. Meanwhile, I was designing marketing campaigns for luxury handbags and calling myself successful." I studied my daughter's face, seeing a sincerity there that reminded me of the earnest little girl who used to help me set tables after school. "What are you planning to do instead?" "That's what I came here to ask you about." Jessica took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump off a cliff. I want to learn how to do what you do. Not just run a restaurant, but build something meaningful. Create something that makes people's lives better instead of just making them want things they can't afford. The request hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us had fully considered. I felt a mixture of pride and concern, excitement and uncertainty. This was the daughter I'd always hoped Jessica might become, but I also knew that wanting to change your life and actually doing it were very different things. Jessica, running a restaurant isn't glamorous work. It's long hours, sore feet, difficult customers, and constant worry about everything from food costs to equipment breakdowns. It's not like what you see on television cooking shows. I know that now. I've been researching the industry, reading about small business management, trying to understand what it really takes to do what you've done. She pulled a notebook from her purse, its pages filled with handwriting I recognized as her neat, precise script. I've been making lists of questions, taking notes on everything I should learn. I couldn't help smiling at this evidence of the organized, methodical approach Jessica brought to everything she cared about. Even her career change was being managed with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to marketing campaigns. "Show me," I said, and she opened the notebook. Eagerly. Page after page was covered with questions about suppliers, inventory management, employee scheduling, health department regulations, and profit margins. She'd researched culinary schools, small business loans, and restaurant industry trends. She'd even printed out articles about family businesses and the challenges of working with relatives. "I don't want to assume anything this time," she said as I reviewed her notes. "I want to learn from the ground up, to understand every aspect of what you do before I make any decisions about my own future." "And you think you want to work in the restaurant industry?" "I think I want to work in something that matters, something that brings people together and makes a real difference in their lives. Maybe that's restaurants, maybe it's something else. But I know I want to learn from someone who's actually done it successfully." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, but I also heard something else. A desperation born from realizing that the life she'd built didn't align with the values she'd discovered she actually held. Jessica was at a crossroads, looking for direction from the mother she'd spent years underestimating. "If you're serious about this, there's only one way to really learn," I said finally. "You'd have to start at the bottom, doing the work that needs to be done without any special treatment, because you're the owner's daughter. You'd have to prove yourself to employees who've earned their positions through years of hard work." "I understand." "You'd have to accept that your expensive education and corporate experience don't automatically qualify you for anything in this environment. You'd be starting over in a field where practical knowledge matters more than credentials." "I get it, Mom. I want to earn whatever I achieve here." I closed her notebook and slid it back across the table. "Then let's see how serious you really are. Can you stay for 2 weeks?" 2 weeks? "A trial period. You'll work every position in this restaurant, from dishwasher to waitress to prep. Cook. You'll work the hours we work, deal with the customers we deal with, handle the problems we handle. At the end of 2 weeks, we'll both know whether this is something you really want to pursue or just an idea that sounds good from a distance." Jessica's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since she was a child. "Yes, absolutely yes. When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning, 5:30. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty and bring comfortable shoes. Your first assignment is helping Tommy prep for the breakfast rush." That evening, after Jessica had left to find a more permanent place to stay than the hotel where she'd been planning to spend one night, I called Tommy into my office to discuss the situation. "She wants to work here?" Tommy asked, his weathered face showing surprise but not disapproval. "For real work, or the kind of symbolic work that rich kids do when they want to feel connected to regular people?" "That's what we're going to find out. I've given her 2 weeks to prove she's serious." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "What do you want me to do with her?" Treat her exactly like you'd treat any new employee. Don't make it easier because she's my daughter, but don't make it harder either. Just give her honest work and honest feedback. And if she can't handle it, then she'll figure that out quickly and go back to Los Angeles with a better understanding of what she's not cut out for. And if she can handle it? That was the question I'd been avoiding, the one with implications that extended far beyond a 2-week trial period. Then we'll deal with that when we get there. Jessica arrived the next morning at 5:20, 10 minutes early, and dressed in old jeans, sneakers, and a plain t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup, except for a light layer of lip balm. She looked more like the teenager who used to help me during summer breaks than the polished executive who'd criticized my life choices 3 months earlier. Tommy put her to work immediately, showing her how to prep vegetables for the morning rush. Onions needed to be diced, peppers cleaned and sliced, potatoes peeled and cubed for hash browns. It was repetitive, unglamorous work that required attention to detail and tolerance for the strong smells of commercial cooking. I watched from the corner of my eye as Jessica struggled with the pace Tommy expected, her knife skills rusty from years of relying on takeout and restaurant meals. Her eyes watered from the onions, and I could see her fighting the urge to wipe them with hands that were covered in food prep gloves. "Keep your fingers curved," Tommy instructed patiently. "The knife should rock, not chop. You're working too hard." Jessica nodded and adjusted her technique, her movements gradually becoming more fluid as muscle memory returned from her teenage years helping in the kitchen. She didn't complain about the tedious nature of the work or ask for breaks, and she listened carefully to every instruction Tommy gave her. By 7 o'clock, when we opened for breakfast, Jessica had completed her prep work and moved on to dishwashing duties. The industrial dishwasher was loud, hot, and unforgiving, requiring constant attention to keep clean plates and utensils flowing to the kitchen and dining room. Steam rose from the machine in thick clouds, and within an hour, Jessica's t-shirt was soaked with sweat, and her hair had frizzed from the humidity. "How are you holding up?" I asked during a brief lull between breakfast and lunch. "I'm tired," she admitted, wiping her face with a clean towel. "And I smell like grease and dishwater. But I'm not quitting." "Good, because this is the easy part. Wait until you deal with your first really difficult customer." That opportunity came during the lunch rush when Jessica was helping Maria serve tables. A businessman in an expensive suit, clearly frustrated about something unrelated to our restaurant, decided to take out his bad mood on Jessica when his order took longer than he expected. "This is ridiculous," he snapped when Jessica approached his table to refill his coffee. "I ordered 20 minutes ago and I haven't even seen my food yet. What kind of operation are you people running here?" Jessica glanced toward the kitchen, where Tommy was working steadily through a stack of orders. "I'm sorry for the wait, sir. We're a little busier than usual today, but your order should be ready very soon." "That's what you said 10 minutes. Ego. I have a meeting to get to, and I don't have time to sit here while you people figure out how to cook a simple sandwich." I could see Jessica's jaw tighten, and for a moment I thought she might respond with the sharp comeback that would have been perfectly acceptable in her former corporate environment. Instead, she took a deep breath and spoke with the kind of patience that can only be learned through experience. "I understand you're in a hurry, sir. Let me check on your order right now and see what I can do to get it out faster." She walked calmly to the kitchen window and spoke quietly with Tommy, who expedited the man's order without complaint. When she returned to the table with his food, the customer was still grumbling, but his tone had softened slightly. "Here's your sandwich, sir, and I've asked our cook to prepare your side of fries fresh, so they'll be extra crispy. Thank you for your patience." After the man left, Maria approached Jessica with something approaching approval. "That was good," she said simply. "You didn't take it personally, and you found a solution instead of making excuses." "He was just having a bad day," Jessica replied. "I've probably been that customer before, and I'm sure someone was patient with me when I didn't deserve it." Over the following days, I watched Jessica tackle every task we gave her with determination and growing competence. She learned to work the register during busy periods, memorized the menu well enough to answer customer questions, and developed calluses on her hands from washing dishes and cleaning tables. She arrived early and stayed late, asking questions about everything from food costs to employee scheduling. More importantly, she began to understand the rhythms of restaurant life, the way energy built throughout the morning rush, the peaceful lull between meals, the controlled chaos of dinner service. She learned to read customers' moods, to anticipate their needs, to provide service that felt personal without being intrusive. On her 8th day, a regular customer, Mrs. Peterson, complimented Jessica's service and asked if she was new to the area. When Jessica explained that she was my daughter, learning the business from the ground up, Mrs. Peterson's face lit up with delight. "Well, you're certainly your mother's daughter," Mrs. Peterson said. "Same attention to detail, same genuine care for people. This place is lucky to have you." That evening, as we closed the restaurant together, Jessica mentioned Mrs. Peterson's comment. "She said I was like you," she said, stacking chairs with practiced efficiency. "I can't remember the last time someone said something that made me feel so proud." "Why is that?" "Because being like you means being someone who makes other people's lives better. Being like you means building something that lasts, something that matters to the community it serves." I studied my daughter's face in the dim light of the dining room. The polished veneer of her corporate persona had been stripped away by 8 days of honest work, revealing someone I was just beginning to recognize. A woman who might actually understand what it meant to build something meaningful from the ground up. "Jessica, what do you think you've learned this week?" She leaned against the counter, considering the question seriously. "I've learned that everything I thought I knew about success was wrong. I've learned that working with your hands doesn't make you less intelligent. It makes you more connected to the real world. I've learned that serving other people isn't beneath anyone. It's the foundation of every business that actually matters." She paused, looking around the restaurant we'd just finished cleaning. "But mostly I've learned that you didn't just build a business, Mom. You built a community. Every customer who comes through that door feels like they belong here, like they're part of something larger than just a commercial transaction. And is that something you want to be part of? More than anything I've ever wanted in my life." The conviction in her voice surprised me with its intensity. This wasn't the enthusiasm of someone trying to convince themselves they'd made the right choice. This was the certainty of someone who'd found their calling. "Then we need to talk about what comes next," I said. "Because if you're serious about staying, we need to figure out how to make this work for both of us." Jessica's face brightened with hope and anticipation. "What did you have in mind?" "Finish your 2 weeks first, then we'll discuss the future." But as I locked up the restaurant that night and drove home through the familiar streets of Henderson, I was already thinking about possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. For 31 years, the Desert Rose had been my dream, my responsibility, my legacy. The idea that it might become something my daughter and I could build together was both thrilling and terrifying in ways I wasn't quite ready to articulate. What I did know was that the woman who'd worked beside me for the past 8 days wasn't the same person who'd told me to stop acting like I owned my own restaurant. Jessica had discovered something about herself in the heat and noise and relentless pace of restaurant life, something that connected her to the values I'd tried to instill in her years ago. Whether that discovery would last beyond the novelty of learning something new remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future of our relationship, and maybe, just maybe, about the future of the Desert Rose itself. 6 months after Jessica's 2-week trial period, I stood in the Desert Rose at dawn, watching my daughter arrange fresh flowers in the vases that now graced every table. The morning light filtered through windows she'd insisted we have professionally cleaned, casting a warm glow over dining room surfaces that sparkled with attention to detail I'd grown too tired to maintain on my own. Jessica had not only stayed. Beyond her initial commitment, she'd transformed both herself and the restaurant in ways I never could have anticipated. The corporate executive who'd once been embarrassed by my life's work had evolved into someone who understood that true success wasn't measured in profit margins alone, but in the depth of relationships built one customer at a time. "The new supplier called," she said without looking up from the flowers. "They can deliver the organic produce we discussed, but it'll cost about 15% more than our current vendor." "What do you think?" I asked, though I already knew her. Answer: "I think our customers will taste the difference, and the ones who care about supporting local farms will appreciate knowing where their food comes from. The increased cost will be offset by customer loyalty and the premium we can charge for genuinely better ingredients." This was how Jessica approached every decision now, not with the short-term thinking that had characterized her corporate career, but with the long-term perspective that sustained businesses require. She'd learned to balance immediate costs against future benefits, to consider how each choice would affect not just profit margins, but community relationships. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy. After her successful 2-week trial, Jessica had returned to Los Angeles to settle her affairs, subletting her expensive apartment and selling the luxury car that no longer fit her new priorities. When she moved back to Henderson permanently, she'd taken a studio apartment 3 blocks from the restaurant and bought a reliable used truck that could handle supply runs and equipment emergencies. For the first 2 months, we'd worked side by side without discussing long-term plans, both of us cautious about moving too quickly toward a partnership that might strain our newly repaired relationship. Jessica proved herself capable in every aspect of restaurant operations, from managing difficult vendors to training new employees to handling the endless paperwork that small business ownership required. The turning point came on a particularly chaotic Saturday evening when our head cook called in sick during the dinner rush. Without hesitation, Jessica stepped into the kitchen and worked alongside Tommy to keep orders flowing, her movements confident and efficient despite having no formal culinary training. Watching her plate dishes with the same care she'd once devoted to marketing presentations, I realized she wasn't just helping out temporarily, she was truly invested in the Desert Rose's success. "We need to talk about the future," I'd told her that night as we cleaned the kitchen together. "I was hoping you'd say that," she'd replied, her smile reflecting both relief and anticipation. Our conversation had led to a gradual restructuring of responsibilities that played to both our strengths. I remained the face of the restaurant, the person customers trusted and employees respected, while Jessica took over much of the administrative work that had grown increasingly burdensome as I aged. She modernized our inventory systems, streamlined our vendor relationships, and implemented cost control measures that improved profitability without compromising quality. More importantly, she brought fresh energy to a business that had been sustained for years by my determination alone. She suggested menu additions that attracted younger customers, while respecting the traditional dishes our regulars expected. She organized community events that strengthened our ties to local organizations. She even convinced me to update our decor, replacing worn furniture with pieces that maintained the Desert Rose's homey atmosphere while creating a more polished overall appearance. The changes hadn't been universally welcomed at first. Some longtime employees viewed Jessica with suspicion, wondering whether the boss's daughter would disrupt established routines or impose corporate-style policies that valued efficiency over relationships. Maria, in particular, had been cautiously polite during Jessica's early months, watching carefully to see how the new arrangement would affect her own position. The breakthrough came when Jessica noticed that Maria had been working extra shifts to cover for other employees' scheduling conflicts, effectively taking on supervisory responsibilities without receiving appropriate compensation. Instead of simply acknowledging Maria's contribution, Jessica researched comparable positions at other restaurants and proposed a formal promotion to assistant manager, complete with a significant raise and benefits package. "You've been doing Management work for months, Jessica had told Maria during their private meeting. You deserve both the title and the compensation that goes with that level of responsibility. From that moment forward, Maria became one of Jessica's strongest supporters, appreciating both the recognition and the business-minded approach that ensured her efforts were properly valued. Other employees took note, realizing that Jessica's corporate background could benefit them if applied thoughtfully to restaurant operations. Now, as I watched Jessica arrange flowers with the same attention to detail she brought to every aspect of her work, I marveled at how completely she'd embraced the values I'd tried to instill in her years ago. She understood that running a restaurant successfully required more than good food and friendly service. It demanded genuine care for the people whose lives intersected with the business every day. "Mom, I've been thinking about something," Jessica said, finally satisfied with her floral arrangements. "What's that?" "I want to add your name to the sign outside. Not replace anything, just add, 'Founded by Michelle Torres,' underneath the Desert Rose name. People should know who built this place." The suggestion caught me off guard, not because it was unwelcome, but because it represented Jessica's complete reversal from the daughter who'd once been embarrassed by my work to someone who wanted to celebrate it publicly. "That's not necessary, honey. People who matter already know the story." But new customers don't, and neither did I for too many years. I want everyone who comes here to understand that they're experiencing something special, something that was created by a woman who built a business from nothing and sustained it for over 3 decades. I studied my daughter's face, seeing pride where shame had once lived, respect where dismissal had once resided. If it's important to you, then we'll do it. It is important to me. Everything about this place is important to me now. The morning rush began shortly after 7, and we fell into the synchronized rhythm we'd developed over months of working together. Jessica handled the register while I moved between tables, greeting regular customers and ensuring newcomers felt welcome. Tommy managed the kitchen with his usual steady competence, while Maria supervised the waitstaff with the authority her new position provided. During a brief lull between breakfast and lunch, Mrs. Chen approached the counter where Jessica was, reviewing the day's reservations. "Jessica, dear," Mrs. Chen said, "I just wanted to tell you how wonderful it's been watching you and your mother work together. You can see how much you both love this place." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I wish I'd figured that out sooner, but I'm grateful for the chance to be part of what she built." "Oh, honey, you're not just part of what she built. You're helping build what comes next. That's even more special." After Mrs. Chen returned to her table, Jessica turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Do you think that's true? That I'm helping build something new instead of just maintaining what already existed? I think you've brought skills and perspectives that have made the Desert Rose stronger than it's ever been. But more than that, you've brought enthusiasm for the work that I was starting to lose. Watching you discover what this place means to our community has reminded me why I fell in love with it in the first place." The lunch crowd was lighter than usual, giving us time to work on projects that required sustained attention. Jessica had been developing a catering menu for local businesses, recognizing an opportunity to expand our revenue without requiring significant additional overhead. I watched her taste test various dishes with Tommy, discussing presentation and pricing with the same analytical approach she'd once applied to marketing campaigns. "The key is creating offerings that showcase what makes us special," she explained as she adjusted seasoning on a signature salad. "Not trying to compete with the big catering companies on volume, but providing something personal and distinctive that reflects the Desert Rose's character." This was vintage Jessica. Strategic thinking applied to practical problems, corporate skills adapted to serve community-focused goals. She'd learned to harness her natural business instincts while embracing the values that made the Desert Rose more than just another restaurant. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself thinking about the conversation we'd had the night before, when Jessica had asked me to consider making her a formal partner in the business. The request hadn't surprised me. We'd been moving in that direction for months, but the implications were significant enough to require careful consideration. "I don't want to inherit this place," she'd said. "I want to earn it. I want to buy in as a partner, to have skin in the game that makes my investment meaningful." Her proposal was thoughtful and fair, offering to purchase a 40% stake in the business at a price determined by independent appraisal. She'd already secured financing through the same bank that had supported me for over 30 years, demonstrating both financial capability and confidence in the Desert Rose's future prospects. "Why 40% instead of 50-50? I'd asked. "Because this is still your dream, your legacy. I want to be your partner, not your replacement. At least not until you're ready for that to change." The humility in her response had touched me deeply. This was a woman who could have demanded equal partnership or even majority control, given her education and business experience. Instead, she was asking for the opportunity to prove herself worthy of gradually assuming greater responsibility as I aged. Now, watching her interact with customers who'd become genuinely fond of her over the past 6 months, I realized my decision had already been made. Jessica hadn't just learned to run a restaurant. She'd learned to care for the community that sustained it. She understood that the Desert Rose's success was measured not just in dollars, but in the strength of relationships that had been built one conversation at a time. "Jessica," I called during a quiet moment in the late afternoon, "let's schedule a meeting with the lawyers next week." Her face lit up with understanding. "Really? Really? It's time to make this partnership official." That evening, as we closed the restaurant together, Jessica surprised me with a small wrapped package. "What's this?" I asked. "Just something I wanted you to have." Inside was a keychain with 2 keys, one for the front door of the Desert Rose, one for the back entrance, attached to a simple silver charm engraved with the restaurant's name and founding date. "I had it made to commemorate our partnership," Jessica explained, "but also to remind us both that some doors can only be opened by people who understand what lies beyond them." I held the keychain in my palm, feeling the weight of both the metal and the metaphor. For 31 years, I'd been the sole keeper of the Desert Rose's keys, the only person responsible for opening and closing the door on each day's possibilities. Now, for the first time, I was ready to share that responsibility with someone who truly understood what it meant. "Thank you," I said, embracing my daughter in the empty dining room where our journey together had begun with conflict and misunderstanding. "For this, and for becoming the person I always hoped you might be. Thank you for giving me the chance to try." As we turned off the lights and locked the doors, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. The Desert Rose would continue beyond my ability to run it alone, sustained by someone who shared my values while bringing fresh energy to its mission. More importantly, my relationship with Jessica had been rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine understanding. Tomorrow we would open the doors again, serving customers who had become family, employing people whose livelihoods depended on our success, contributing to a community that had supported us through every challenge. But now that work would be shared by 2 women who understood that true ownership meant more than having your name on legal documents. It meant taking responsibility for something larger than yourself. The Desert Rose had begun as my dream, but it was becoming our legacy, and that transformation felt like the greatest success of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.